I was asked if I could give a talk in responding really to one particular part of the current Edgelands exhibition, which is the collection of visual arts and some literature that were curated by Ben Rivers in the room next to it, which really deals with this whole question of landscape in a post-industrial society. I've called the talk Modern Nature, and it comes from a very favourite book of mine, which is Derek Jarman's diaries, which it was published in 1991, called Modern Nature. And he got the title from a conversation he had with Maggie Hamilton, and I'll just read this because it gives, in a way, sets the scene for the talk. He was talking about his garden at Dungeness. He said, "I was describing the garden to Maggie Hamblin at a gallery opening and said I intended to write a book about it. She said, 'Ah, you've finally discovered nature, Derek.' 'I don't think it's really quite like that,' I said, thinking of Constable and Samuel Palmer's Kent. 'Ah, I understand completely. You've discovered modern nature.'" And this thing about modern nature, which is what, in a way, Jarman was trying to construct at Dungeness, is a kind of how one assembles new landscapes with the fragments of the old, with the fragments of the indigenous, the local, creating a new aesthetic out of this strange mixture of old and new, and very much what was found, as it were, the found conditions of a particular place. Now, there's a very appetite talking about Jarman tonight, because 2 hours ago, this was before the 5 to 6 fiasco at Highbury Station, my wife came in back into the flat and she said, "Do you know what?" She said, I've just read, Derek Jarman's house and garden have been sold. And do you know who to? EDF, the nuclear power company. And my heart sank that this kind of last place of a kind of, that really was a step into the future, a way of thinking and understanding about the future, has now itself been absorbed and incorporated into the mainstream, and not only the mainstream, but a different kind of vision of the future, which is not about the indigenous, the local, and the found conditions. So this first slide is a slide of Cudmore Grove in Essex. It's on Mersey Island, which happens to be one of the favourite places of mine. And it's a beach that has been a place where both the remains of hippopotamuses and elephants have been found. It's also a site of very extensive Second World War military remains, and it has a kind of bleakness that I think is becoming very important. And it's important to me because it's in Essex, and I come from Essex, and for, I suppose, the last 20 years I've been thinking a lot about how to respond to the increasing denigration, devaluation, ridicule of the county, not simply as a place, it has been called a bastard countryside, but actually as but also of the people of the place as actually exemplifying some of those bastard, unearthly, hybrid characteristics. And so from 20 years ago I started collecting stuff for a long book on Essex in the 20th century. I've always seen the county as a kind of experimental laboratory for social change in England in a much more wider context. It saw industrialisation, it saw, as long with that industrialisation, saw the growth in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of experimental communities, land colonies, experiments in living. It saw obviously the docks, the trade on the rivers, including the Thames. Essex is a county with 5 major rivers. Much transport at the beginning of the century was river transport. So it has been this kind of laboratory, I think, for a new kind of Englishness. So I collected something like 5 box folders of material, basically about the social history of the county in the 20th century. And at some point in the 1960s, of course, it was part of Essex was separated out and taken back into London, and in a way its urban heart was taken away from it, and it became regarded really as a kind of suburban landscape, or suburban landscape and culture. And when I went to publishers with this idea, they were quite keen on it, because there was so much talk at the time about Essex girls and Essex men, and somehow Essex, the people of Essex had seemed to kind of lost their way, and the working class were now all voting Conservative, and the young women were just having a good time and lost any interest in, allegedly, in culture and so on. And so this kind of rather grim, very unflattering, and actually to me deeply offensive portrait of Essex, I felt had to be challenged. Unfortunately, what the publishers wanted was a repetition of that kind of story. They said, well, you're going to start with a few Essex girl jokes, or you're going to start, you know, with talking about Essex man and, you know, his uncouth behaviour and so on. I said, no, that's not what it's about. And I couldn't find a way of explaining what I felt both about the county, its landscape, its social history in the 20th century, and the people who lived there. And in 2005, and actually in 2004, a photographer who I didn't know, Jason Alton, got in touch with me, and he'd been commissioned by the Essex County Council to produce an exhibition of photographs on contemporary Essex coastline. And he'd taken most of the photographs prior to me meeting him, and these photographs have been given over to Essex County Council Arts Department, who'd show them to a few politicians, and the politicians said, no way, you know, these photographs are not what we want to represent Essex. We want beach huts, we want sunsets, we want candy floss, we want happy children sitting on the beach with sand buckets and spades. What Jason had actually shown was the coastline as it really is, a rather beautiful but post-industrial melange of kind of industrial, geological, military elements, and also obviously agriculture and a maritime tradition as well, lots of boatyards and dockyards as well. And it seemed that Jason said that it was kind of stalemate. The politicians weren't going to accept this. He got in touch with me, and we had a meeting with the arts team at, you know, there, and it became clear that what the photographs needed was some kind of context, a textual context or a literary context, some kind of context that said, well, this is how Essex looks the way it does now, because this is what happened to it. And I found that under the stimulus of Jason's photographs, in 9,000 words, I was able to write an essay that actually said everything I wanted to say about Essex, that I couldn't say in 100,000 words of text, but I could, working with a photographer like Jason. The combination of the photographs and the fairly attenuated essay about social history came together to really, I hope, explain what we were trying to say. And that book became 350 Miles, and the County Council were very happy to publish it, and it sold about over 3,000 copies. But it was that kind of combination of the word and image which fascinates me, and ever since then I've decided I couldn't possibly write without working with a photographer or a visual artist in some way, because I think that combination is still the most dynamic way of thinking and describing about landscape. The other thing I will shortly say, this was 350 Miles. Just before, in 2004, the book came out, I came across an edition of the magazine Country Life, which some of you may or may not know, which is very much around, well, what it says, but it's very much about country houses and rather very organised landscapes, very highly designed historic landscapes. And the magazine Country Life had gone through the counties and had kind of done a kind of which was becoming very popular, kind of hit list, 10 best this, 10 best that. So they'd written out all the counties and then ascribed to them marks out of 10 for particular qualities, whether it might be the qualities of its historic architecture, the qualities of its town centres, its churches, its shopping, its landscape and so on. And Country Life gave Essex 0 marks out of 10 for landscape beauty. And this seemed to me completely wrong, that they were actually asking the wrong questions in the 21st century, that these kinds of landscapes, which are the landscapes that most of us now inhabit, they've somehow found wanting and found inappropriate. And I think this is still a big issue in landscape aesthetics. What is appropriate and inappropriate? So which is why the kind of Edgelands exhibition next door kind of charts the processes by which particularly artists have allowed us and helped us to rethink what we understand as kind of what is appropriate, acceptable, beautiful even in the 21st century. And later on, we followed that up with the New English landscape. 350 miles is essentially about the coastline. The New English landscape was really about ways of living. And one of the things we photographed, visited, interviewed, were people who had, at some point, mostly prior to the Second World War, been involved in various forms of land colonies, whether they might be religious or political. At the beginning of the 20th century, it may come as a surprise to you that Essex had at least 6 Tolstoyan communities, people who'd gathered together in the spirit of Tolstoy's, kind of Christian belief or vision, to go back to the land and to live in a different way. There were a number of anarchist colonies. The East London socialists often funded people to go out and farm or run allotments in the landscape. And of course, there were the plotlands in Leindon, on Camden Island, in other places where East Londoners went out to kind of make a little part of the countryside their own. The one that I know best is the colony, the Salvation Army colony at Hadley, which is in Essex on the coastline as you get towards Southend. I grew up near Hadley. It was established in 1896 by the Salvation Army. They bought a large amount of agricultural land and it became a farm colony for men from the East End of London who were suffering from poverty, alcoholism and so on. It was to a kind of place of rehabilitation. And it's still there, 130 years later. Today, I mean, very interestingly, it's moved with the times. It's run as an organic farm and it trains young people with learning disabilities in farming, in agriculture, in catering, and they have a restaurant, a cafe and so on to do that. So that kind of social history had kind of almost been forgotten in the history of the landscape. But it seemed to me important for people to remember it. We prefaced the New English landscape with a quotation which is very dear to me from Gombrich's book, The Story of Art. We cannot easily separate what we see from what we know. Is that right? Yes. And this seems to me at the heart of the way you understand landscape. If you simply see it as a visual construct, which is what so many books tell you to do and which so many coach tours tell you to do and tour guides do, they take you to a place, a Belvedere or somewhere where you can look out and capture in a single image the essence of landscape. But what Gombrich was saying is that unless you know the history, the geology, you can never really understand it. And so this rather, some would say, bleak photograph of the River Lea, just some of you will know it, it's near Lea Bridge Road, it's near the Middlesex filter beds. That's not a sewage pipe going over. I think it actually probably is a sewage pipe going over. But the River Lea, it's beginning to come back into kind of focus now. But until I would guess about 20 years ago, it was regarded as a backwater of little aesthetic merit, of little ecological merit, let alone. But the River Lea has been called the heart of the Second Industrial Revolution. From the 1890s onwards, a wide range of industries set up along the River Lea, ranging, a lot of it brought up by barge from the docks, obviously timber, furniture making, then light aircraft, chemicals, photography, and one academic has produced a 5-volume history of the industrial history of the River Lea. And I think now we really appreciate the River Lea as being second only to the River Thames in its historic importance to the lives of London, certainly in the 20th and the 21st century. And unless you know that history, this kind of bit of, slightly overgrown river can seem to be redundant, but actually it's full of meaning. Much of the way we think about landscape changed in a way as a result of the Second World War. There was this amazing project called Recording Britain, set up in 1940 by the government. They were very worried about, firstly, paintings and lots of invaluable goods from all around the country were collected together and, as we know, secreted in mines in Wales until the war was over. They were feared that if Britain were invaded, that all these goods and treasures would be taken away. But they also encouraged a lot of artists to record visually in photographs and paintings English life as it then was. And some of these paintings were kind of used to promote, in wartime, the propaganda, the image of England, in this case it is England, or Britain, in this case Britain, sorry, that's my fault, of the Britain that the war was being fought for, that our endeavours were protecting. And that England, at the beginning of the war, was very much the bucolic, deep interior of England, very green, very hilly, almost medieval, the church, the cathedral close and so on. And this was a kind of image of England, of Britain, that was being promoted to the troops, but also to the outside world as that which actually embodied, or Englishness, as we know it. There was a kind of problem about this, because in 1941, in the Blitz, there was some resistance by a lot of Londoners or troops from the cities that they didn't actually know anything about this. They had come from terraced houses, they'd come from industrial cities, towns and cities, and they knew, what England or Britain was for them was not this bucolic landscape. But also, in the war, a number of artists began to see the landscape in a different way. And probably the most famous of these is the painter Paul Nash. And this is a painting of a dogfight, and it's bound, that has to be on the south coast, and that has to be the very winding river that goes through Alfriston. You must know it, where Virginia Woolf drowned herself. Come on. I think it is the Ouse, yes. Yeah. But they began to see, that the landscape we were kind of protecting was mostly at the edges, not in the centre, and it was actually at the eastern edges. So you get a painting by Prunella Clough from 1941, and of course she's exhibited, 2 of her paintings are next door. And she's painting a rather derelict scene, but the orange kind of pylon type things are forms of anti-tank or anti-landing gear. And again, she's kind of thinking about the East Coast as the landscape that really is the most vulnerable and the one that needs to be recorded most importantly. And it relates back to a very influential essay written by John Piper in 1938, only published in France, strangely, which was called Abstraction on the Beach. And he particularly saw that the beach really somehow represented the shingle beach, bits of ruins, old boats. Somehow this was actually more profound in a way of representing Englishness, or Britishness, than the deep interior. And in the next image, this is the first photograph in 350 miles, one of Jason's photographs. It's a mine-watching tower on the coast, on the Dengie Peninsula. If you think you want to be lonely and you really want to get away from everybody, you just take a train out from Liverpool Street Station to the final stop after Burnham-on-Crouch. I've forgotten its name for a minute. It's a single-track railway. It's only about 40 minutes from Liverpool Street Station. You come into the Dengie Peninsula and there is absolutely nobody else around on this large peninsula. And the mine-watching tower was built obviously at the beginning of the Second World War. It's near Burnham-on-Crouch and it has very monumental form. And this does, again, reminds me of the essay that is alluded to in the exhibition next door, Robert Smithson's famous essay, The Monuments of Passaic, which really you do have to read it if you haven't. It is one of the key essays of the 20th century in which a young artist living in New Jersey walks through the place he lives in and sees it in a completely new way. The filling stations, the disused stockyards, the railway sidings and so on. Suddenly he sees this as important as Rome. He sees these monumental structures as having the same kind of presence, evocation, as we might find in the ruins of Rome. And obviously people in Essex, strangely, feel the same about these monuments. Essex still has something like 10,000 pillboxes, gun emplacements really, made from reinforced concrete. And interestingly, they're now become part of the landscape. And I think if anybody were now to say we have to get rid of them, they would be strongly opposed because they have, in a way, been integrated in the landscape because of the role they played. Luckily, they weren't used, but they were there and they represent what that landscape was kind of trying to defend at that time. And to take them away would be like kind of erasing a very important memory from your past. And I think this is not just simply a matter that relates to Essex. In the New English landscape, I discussed a conversation I had with a Methodist minister who runs a charity involved in reclaiming former mining sites in around Sheffield. And he tells us his grandfather was a miner, and his grandfather worked at the Cudmore mine, and he went there to ask what had happened to all the records of, basically the pit gear and the mining, the shafts and everything had been erased, but all the records of everybody who had ever worked there, photographs, accident books, everything, had been put into the mine, thrown into the mine, and the top concreted over, as though, 150 years of history and the people's lives involved in that history didn't matter. Just get rid of it. And this is why I think, there's this interest now in the preservation of important ruins that have become part, in a way, of the national psyche. And this is Cudmore Grove again. This is only 100 yards further down the beach from that opening image. Again, it's the ruins of a military emplacement. If we're talking about the new landscape or the new nature, I've just picked out these 5 things that I think have influenced, crucially, the way we understand landscape in the modern world. Firstly, we've got out of the car. We know that we really have to walk the landscape. It's a phenomenological experience. It has to be experienced in motion, it has to be experienced through the senses, it has to be experienced through physical contact with the terrain. Now, up until the Second World War, most books about English landscape were written and published for the glove compartment of the car. They were sponsored by petrol companies, Shell or BP. They employed wonderful photographers and visual artists. But nevertheless, they were kind of designed for the car driver who would, with his or her companions, would set out in the morning on a motor tour, and it would tell them where to stop, where to have their picnic, and what to look at. But I think in more recent times we really understood that that's no way really to understand the landscape. I think the gravitation of interest in landscape has moved from the more pastoral, romantic west, Devon, Cornwall, Lake District, and so on, to the east, to, partly as a result of the Second World War, to an interest in these kind of coastal regions. And is it an accident? I don't know. But if you think of all the people writing about landscape who've had a big influence in the last 20 years, 30 years, Richard Mabey, Robert Macfarlane, Helen Macdonald, I'm about to forget someone terribly important, and it is W.G. Sebald, but there are others. They're all writing about East Anglia. Something about East Anglia has caught their imagination. And for Sebald, and for me particularly, it's to do with a connection, a wartime connection with Europe. I feel as much European as I feel English, and Sebald was very good at seeing how Liverpool Street Station, the arrival point of the kinder transports, the children fleeing from Nazi Germany, the arrival point for lots of refugees. For him, Liverpool Street Station was a kind of fulcrum that, on which balanced Englishness and European and the tragedies of European history. So he also called the East the place of lost causes, which is not very cheerful, but nevertheless, that was the East. This single viewpoint, you know, the fixed point has given way to a phenomenological way of understanding landscape through the whole range of experiences. And it's gone from history, if I may say so, to contested memory. Rather than a conventional history of the picturesque and the pre-romantic, the romantic, and so on. It's much more about whose landscape, whose history. Is there a war going on, or not a war, but there are conflicts always going on about what you do or do not preserve in a landscape, what is appropriate and inappropriate to locate or keep located in a landscape. It's much more contested. There's nobody, I don't think, could come into this room now and say, this is beautiful and everything else is not beautiful. You can't do that anymore. You have to discuss it, you have to contextualise it. And from the pastoral to the post-industrial, that's clear. And in my own work, which is very much around parks policy, what I have seen over the last 30 years is a preoccupation with the park as a bounded space, a space very much full of meaning, community meaning, local identity, all that. It's being opened up, partly with the rise of cycling, partly through ecological, environmental pressures. Seeing London, for example, as a set of discrete islands of green is no longer works. It can't work. It has to be seen as a network connecting up so that flora and fauna can travel through these green networks, as can pedestrians, walkers and cyclists, which is the move really from this kind of notion of a city as being a collection of green islands to a city of green networks, and that this notion of connectivity is now very much part of and paths and bridges and networks. And of course there is trauma in the landscape. I was actually, when my family left the East End of London when I was 6 from Leytonstone, we moved to Camden Island. But we moved away a year before the 1953 floods, which were the 21st of January 1953, when over 300 people died in East Anglia. 55 people died on Canvey. The whole island disappeared below water. You could not see any land. And it happened on a number of the islands around Essex. And that initially triggered the response, an engineering response. Oh, we must build higher seawalls, we must concrete more, we must turn all the rivers into large kind of ducts, aqueducts, culvert the rivers, and we'll find an engineering solution to the dangers of flooding. And then the barrier bridge, the Thames barrier was built. In the last 10 years, people have realised, following the Dutch, that this is no solution. You have to do the opposite. You have to naturalise the landscape. You have to actually almost take down the seawalls in some places, allow the land to flood. You have to stop people in London paving over their rotten front garden, well, their beautiful front gardens, and turn them into carports. You have to find a way of naturalising the city and the landscape so that water, rainwater, floodwater will naturally flow in and out and not be funneled dangerously from one place to the other. And I think in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to see much more emphasis on the naturalisation of London rather than more big concrete pipes, more this, more that, because it's not going to work. So coming towards the end then, I think the two people in a way that have been responsible for this return to the notion that you have to walk the landscape, you have to understand the social history of the landscape in order to understand the landscape. W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn, which is a walk round Suffolk. I don't think it's one of his best books. My favourite by far is Austerlitz, which ends at Liverpool Street Station, which is a station I love. And Ian Sinclair's Edge of the Orison, tracking the journey of John Clare from Essex back to Cambridgeshire. But again, it's these writers, and Sebald also uses photography, who have made us rethink what travel writing is, nature writing is, and landscape appreciation is. It is about understanding understanding the history, being in the terrain. There's been a little bit of impetus for this new way of thinking from the European Landscape Convention, which was passed in Florence in 2000. The British government, soon to be the English government probably, ratified it in 2004, and it says that each party undertakes to recognise landscapes in law as an essential component of people's surroundings, an expression of the diversity of their shared cultural and natural heritage, and a foundation of their identity. I think landscape really is coming into the foreground now as a key component of how we think about ourselves and our place in the world, and our attachments, our emotional attachments to place. the two great, I think, visual artists for me who contributed to this new way of thinking about landscape were Derek Jarman and Ian Hamilton Findlay. This is Jarman's cottage, photographs taken by my wife. We went there about 10 years ago, and this is the one apparently that's just been sold to the nuclear power company EDF. But you can see the kind of elements of the stones, the bricks, the ironwork, the rusting things, the bits of old boats have been brought together to produce this fantastic landscape. I'm just going to finish with three of Jason's photographs from the New English landscape. This is Horsey Island. We were travelling, well, we spent 3 days on Horsey Island in the very bitter February of 2013, I think 2013. It's an island, you can't go onto it, it's a bird sanctuary, it's a private island. And this, I think, a wonderful photograph because it just seems so Chinese, but this is the boatyard at Bentley, which is only about 6 miles from Southend. You can get off the train from Liverpool Street Station. It's completely wonderful. And the final image is, the island is on the far side of this causeway, Horsey Island, where we stayed 3 nights in the bitter cold. But Essex has 30 islands, many of them only available, you can only access them in limited periods between tides. And in fact, the causeway is below the level of the mud. It's not above it. So if you drive across the causeway, as we did, your eye level is actually level with the seabirds and the wonderful ones with the spiky tops, who I love. Can't remember their name, I'll remember later. But and this notion of the tidal landscape is really a subject on which we could have another lecture, but it won't be tonight. But thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was a really interesting talk. I wonder if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask.
Thanks. I'm Julian Lewis, and thank you for that lovely lecture. I'm wondering how it's possible to use these observations in such a way as to encourage new development, much of which is inevitable in some of these areas. It's a sort of practical question, really, because I think it should be possible to build this proactively into policy and to encourage developers to take this on board as part of the narrative, part of that need for understanding places that you've talked about.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a hope, a bit more than a question, but I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts about how to spike this towards the government to support good housing and other uses.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. I think it's not a matter of architectural style or design so much as the issue that most of the landscapes I've shown have been what Raymond Williams called working landscapes. There's an integration between the buildings and the economic activity. I think it's very interesting in English social history that if you look up to about 1750, look up to the rise of Romanticism, people like Cobbett, John Even and so on, they were going around the country. What were they interested in? They were interested in brewing, the different varieties of pigs, how farmers, rotated crops. They were interested in how people lived. After Romantics, it was, my God, what experience have I had in this, in these Welsh mountains kind of thing. So I think it's, you know, that obviously I'm in favour of new development because people have got to live and they've got to have new places to live because there are new, you know, there's new populations. But it's how we integrate those with work. And I'm most at the moment inspired by a book by a woman architectural writer called Frances Hollis on live work, because it's a study of contemporary live-work arrangements, some informal and spontaneous, some planned, in Britain and in Japan and in Europe. So in Japan it's much more strongly, I mean much more evident. I've never been to Japan, but she has this wonderful kind of model of, you know, in a small town, it's not uncommon that there's a shop front, you go into the shop front and there's one level, and then you go to the shop front, there's a kitchen, but they might be serving food to the people in the shop. You go back one further, and it's kind of beginning to get into the private domain and so on. But she's also got photographs of people living on council estates in new towns, who turn a garage into a hairdressing salon, who breed, you know, expensive goldfish, you know, in their front room for sale. But the fact is, and one of her statistics is that 25% of the working population now work more than 8 hours a week at home. In more cities now in Britain, there are more women at work in cities in Britain now than there are men. Developers, house builders aren't in any way responsive to these enormous demographic and social shifts in the way we live. The problem with the new towns, I mean, I grew up near a new town near Basildon, and I had a lot of teenage friends, was that all the houses in Basildon and Harlow were built for families. There were no one-bedroom flats. The assumption was that you stayed with your family until they either chucked you out or you got married and you moved further up the road and started your own family. But the idea that one would have a life between leaving a family and starting your own family, well, that's the best life sometimes, didn't exist in the kind of policy framework. So I think the development, which obviously we have to have development, but it has to recognise the social demographic and the employment and economic context in which, because otherwise you're just going to get more and more dormitory suburbs and dormitory towns.
Are there any other questions? So the galleries are open until 9 o'clock if there's no other questions, and the cafe is as well if you'd like to join us for a drink. And can we just and Ken's book is on sale in the bookshop downstairs. I think we had sold out, but we've got some more in this evening, do we? So can you join me in thanking Ken once again for his talk?